Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be covering history's richest people. This is only a select few. There are more people that can go into this list. These are just the ones that I believe had the most wealth, with some familiar faces just to give some reference of who we're dealing with in terms of wealth. And to start it off, we have Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was king of Macedonia. He ruled for a very short period of time, something like a little over 10 years. He died fairly young, but that being said, the guy also conquered most of the known world, so he owned all of Greece, all of Anatolia, all of Persia, parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Egypt, and parts of the Levantine coast, so like Israel, Lebanon, that all would have also been under his control as well. Now, that being said, I think he could buy whole countries. It was also an absolute monarchy as well. So not only was he one of history's greatest conquerors and he owned a lot of things, because it was an absolute monarchy, he owned all of it. It was all under his name. Even if others might have had property or ownership, he owned all of them. He was still above them. So we also have to do count in the fact that not only was everything in his name, but it was also a lot of stuff. It wasn't only his stuff too. It was everyone he came into contact with. If he wanted to, he could take their stuff. That being said, he was pretty humble. To his credit, he didn't really seem to care about wealth. He was more interested in just conquering things because who knows, maybe he just really liked conquering things. But anyway, he could buy whole countries. He's a strong contender for one of the richest men in all of human history, but I don't think he's the absolute one purely because he did die young and he didn't own everything, unlike some of the other people here who actually had bigger empires than Alexander, although he had one of the biggest. Next up, we have this is Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He's easily up there alongside Alexander. He's not quite as I don't think he's quite as rich as Alexander because even though he was the emperor of the Roman Empire, the first one, his power was somewhat limited, especially early on. He had to kind of play around with the idea that he was also just part of the Senate. He was just considered to be like one of the more important people. The Senate didn't go anyway. They still had meetings. They still had consuls and things like that, that office. So it was not like his power was absolute. Don't get me wrong, it was very close to absolute. He also oversaw the greatest expansion in all of Roman history, and he also was adopted by Julius Caesar, who was another one of Rome's richest people. He's not on this list, but I don't think he was the richest. But the end of his life, he was one of the richest, and Augustus inherited all of that. Plus, everything that Rome conquered was also pretty much under him, and he ruled for the longest time. And he's also considered to be one of the greatest emperors ever. So easily could buy whole countries. One of the richest men ever done. Next up, we have Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the three triumvirs, considered the richest man in Rome. And what he would do, I'm going to put him at super rich, and I'm just going to explain him a little bit. So, what he would do is he would wait around for fires to destroy cheap housing, and then he would either charge people extremely high amounts to rebuild, and he would rebuild kind of cheap housing again, which would also be subject to being burned down. Something along those lines of like a property scheme. Something along the lines of that. I might be messing up on some of the details, but he did some very shady stuff. But he got extremely rich, and he was considered the richest man in all of Rome. But he was a terrible general. He wanted to go and invade Iran, and he failed, and he was killed. And they made a mockery of him because he tried to invade the Parthian Empire, and he died in the first major battle to an army that was about a quarter of the strength of the Roman army. So that was pretty embarrassing. And he was also friends with two of Rome's greatest generals, Pompey and of course Julius. And none of them thought that he was shit because he couldn't lead an army. And when he tried to lead an army, yeah, he got absolutely massacred for trying to prove his worth. That being said, he's still super rich, one of history's richest people. I think he's going to go into the super rich. Next up, Mansa Musa. This one is going to be a bit controversial. I don't think he's as rich as these guys. I'm going to still put him above Crassus, but I don't believe he's as rich as these guys, and I'll explain. So he was the emperor of the Mali Empire, I believe, and he owned most of the world's gold. Now, that being said, gold being an extremely valuable resource and being worth a lot, that being said, he also didn't rule over a lot of lands. If you're going to be up into these higher categories, you actually have to rule over a lot of land and a lot more resources. Just because he had all of the gold in the world didn't mean that he had access to all of the resources of the world. There were other resources that were not under his control. Most of the world's gold supply was under his control, but other resources were not. And there's stories about him making a pillage to Mecca. And when he did, he went to Egypt and he gave out so much gold it shattered the local economies. So that's another point to him. But it wasn't a decision where he is going to be able to buy whole countries purely because you need to have more conquests to be up here. So I think super rich makes sense for Mansa Musa. He's remembered as a lot of the time being as history's most successful and richest man, but he's definitely not. I don't think so, purely because, again, the absolute monarchy is there, but he didn't have control over a lot of other resources, just mainly gold. Next up, we have Mayer Rothschild. So the Rothschilds were at one point considered to be the richest family ever, and Mayer is the guy whom founded all of it. He is like the original Rothschild. He was a poor he was someone who was like a poor Jewish minority in Europe, and then he got in line to be like one of the financiers because the royalty would use Jews to do banking and things like that. Because in Judaism, interest rates are not seen as anything right or wrong; it's just part of life. Whereas in Christianity, if you charge an interest rate, this is seen as something that is wrong. But of course, in finance, you do need to charge interest rates. So, regardless of whatever the beliefs of the kings of Europe were, they would need Jews to do financing for them because you couldn't really get a lot of Christians to do it. It was not considered to be the right thing. So, but he's gonna go into the rich category. If this was the Rothschilds, they would definitely be up to could buy whole countries if we believe their net worth figure of 500 billion. That being said, there is no evidence of how rich Mayer was himself. He was probably very rich and well off, but this was before the family would get really rich when he would send, I believe, five of his children to five different countries in Europe to start up banks, and all of those banks were extremely successful. That's when they got really rich, but just Mayer on his own, I think him being in the rich category makes sense. He would technically be in the brokey category if it was a direct comparison, but if you're comparing also the legacy that he left behind, he is easily going to go up one rank just because of his legacy. But we're not going to overrate his legacy and count the wealth of his future successors, but his wealth on his own would cement him a spot in just rich. Next up, I believe this is Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest Americans ever. I believe he was the second, and comparatively, he owned something like 1% of the US GDP, which in the modern day would be somewhere near Elon Musk's net worth, around 400 billion. So what he did was he was one of the railroad barons, and he did a lot of just basic materials, oil, steel, and railroads. This was the original way that you would get super wealthy in America early on, the robber barons. But he's going to go into the rich category, also turn to good philanthropy. So I don't think he's the worst of these guys. He didn't conquer anything. He had some dubious business practices, as do most of the people who get rich here. But that being said, he was a philanthropist too, so he wasn't the worst person here. He's just going to go into the rich category. I am going to actually put him above Mayer, though. Next up, this is King Solomon. I don't know why he shows up here twice, but for King Solomon, he would have ruled over Israel, and he was said to be like one of the richest men in the world. That being said, because it is a biblical source, and maybe there was a King of Solomon, it's hard to say. And if he was as rich as he was claimed to be, the main issue with this is he doesn't really own a lot. He just, ruled over Israel, so that would limit how much wealth he had. So because of that, because we can't confirm how much wealth he had and what he would have ruled over would have been relatively small. It would have just been over Israel and maybe parts of the Levant. So not a lot of land, and he didn't have any companies, no businesses, not a lot of resources, at least what we can find. And his story is a little dubious. He's going to go into the Brokey tier, unfortunately. Next up, this is John Paul Getty. So John Paul Getty, he founded Getty Oil, another one of these oil barons. He's not one of the top richest Americans. I believe he's the third. Sorry, he is one of the top, but he's not the number one. He's poorer than Carnegie. I would say richer than Mayer. So I'm gonna put him in between these two. He was like the third richest American ever. He founded Getty Oil. He was also a philanthropist. He gave away a lot of his wealth. There were some other controversies with him. I believe there was some sort of allegations against him or one of his successors that became a relatively big stain on him. But that being said, he was still a philanthropist. He gave away, and on top of that, the family still, I believe, they still own Getty Images. So that's from Getty himself. That's from the successors of the Getty family. And he also did donate and help create the Getty Center, the Getty Museum. So next up, this guy. This guy is probably fairly unknown. I'm not sure how well you could see his image. Doesn't seem like the crop captured the crop cut off top of his head. But this is Emperor Kangxi of China, so King China. China, when it was pretty much at its territorial extent and one of the most powerful dynasties. Towards the end, it will go into the century of humiliation, but this is one of the longest leaders of it. He led over it for around 60 years when it was at its most powerful. He's also pretty well regarded as being a good ruler, and the simple fact that he ruled over so much of Earth's resources and GDP, and it was somewhat of an absolute monarchy. He's just going to go into could buy whole countries. I might even put him above Augustus, actually, because Augustus at his start still had to bow to the Senate. Changshi probably not anywhere near as much to court officials, even if there is maybe more conspiracies and plotting by the eunuchs and whatnot. Next up, pretty unknown guy in terms of wealth, but pretty famous for what he did. This is Khosrow II, and Khosrow II was Shah of Sassanid Iran at Iran when it was at its height, when it had conquered almost the entirety of the Eastern Roman Empire in the war of the final Persian War during around the early 600s. That being said, he's going to go into Baroque category. He did own a lot of land, but the war was exhaustive. The war ended in somewhat of a defeat for the Iranians as they would have to retreat and everything kind of went back to normal, but he exhausted pretty much all of the resources and he ends up being killed. And then there's a civil war, and then the Arabs will take over. And then there's also a plague in Iran called the Plague of Khosrow, which kills something like half the population as much of, and it's probably some like bubonic plague. So due to the fact that a lot of the gains he had was purely during a war, he didn't rule over a long time, and on top of that, he had to give it up, and his country suffered great material loss, and then there was a disease. Yeah, his wealth would have plummeted at his peak. He might have been super rich, but the fact that he didn't control it for a long time either, and there was so much chaos in Persia at the time, he would have pretty much been a brokey. Okay, this guy right here, this is the one. This is the one in 100 billion. This is the richest human of all time. Oh, I gotta scroll up. Let's stick him up right. He belongs. This guy's relatively unknown. He is the emperor of the Mongols. When the Mongol Empire was at its height, there was no one on earth who had absolute control over more land than this guy. This guy is Monkey Khan, and he was, I believe, the third or second emperor of the Mongols. And he ruled when the Mongolian Empire was not only at its peak, but also when he could pretty much take anything he wanted. They were also at their most brutal, and he was an absolute monarch. He had no one he had to answer to, and everything on Earth that the Mongols ruled, would have all been under his name. He would have owned pretty much all of it, and the Mongolian Empire is the second largest empire in all of human history, and it's the number one in terms of continuous land. So there were no breaks. It was not like the British Empire where you had a bunch of islands here and there and some land here and there all over. It was disconnected. Everything was connected. So he's easily number one. They ruled pretty much over over Iran, Anatolia, much of Russia, modern day Russia, much of modern day China. There were some parts of China that would hold out until Kublai would conquer it, but they still owned over much of China. Everything in Central Asia, Mongolia, Siberia, parts of India, parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of the Levant, all were pretty much under his control. So yeah, he is 1 in 100 billion. He was the richest person to ever have lived. That being said, he didn't live for so long. I believe, I don't know how long his reign was, but comparatively, it wasn't super long. Ogadai had a bit of a longer reign than Monke, so he didn't rule for a long time, but for when he did, he owned 100% of everything. So he is number one. There was no one in human history where they owned more of Earth and had more control over it. So yeah, he is the number one guy. Next up, we have Rockefeller. So Rockefeller was, I'm going to put him up into super rich. Rockefeller was the richest American in all of human history. He owned 1 to 2% of the US GDP. So that would have actually made him richer than Elon Musk comparatively. That would have been somewhere in the range of $500 billion. Yeah, he is unfathomably rich, and I believe he deserves to go into super rich. That being said, he is not higher than I don't think these other guys, purely because there's some limitations to wealth. Again, when you're talking the modern day, the two ways that you can get wealthy is by owning things or like an inheritance. These people, they owned things that you can't own nowadays. Like this guy, Crassus owned slaves, and he was the owner of like an empire of a country. So that being said, like we do have to factor that in. I know that's kind of not the best take to factor in, say, like slave ownership as a part of wealth. But if you're gonna count how much they owned, that is part of it. That's what actually would say. I would say Crassus is richer because he quite literally had slaves, and he could also buy out soldiers. Like the guy could own an army. And maybe Rockefeller, sorry, not Carnegie. Rockefeller could too. It's not like he couldn't pay enough money to have his own army, but it's something that's not allowed. So that's also like a limitation on their power, which I do think is important to consider because there was a limitation on his power and because his wealth could only be from his businesses, which were, again, railroad, oil, steel, those type of things. There's some limiting factors. So for that fact, I'm gonna put him into super rich, but I wouldn't put him above these other guys. So next up, we have Trump. Trump is a brokey. He is bottom of this list. He only has a few $1 billion, and it's mainly real estate and some like scam social media site. Comparatively, he has a lot of power to some of these guys, but that being said, he also does not have a lot of money. He only has like 4 to 8 billion dollars, which would put him at the bottom of brokey territory. Next up, Queen Victoria. She's gonna go right up along at the bottom of could buy whole countries, purely because while she was the Queen of England when the British Empire was at its absolute height, they owned absolutely everything. She also had limitations on her power. There were certain things that she could not do. Um, there was a British Parliament in her time that had already happened. The Magna Carta was already signed well by her reign and everything. So that being said, there was decent limitations on her power, which is why I'm gonna put her at the bottom of could buy whole countries. That being said, she was the monarch of the British Empire at its absolute peak. She oversaw it. She would have been, if all the land was it was an absolute monarchy, she would have ruled over more of Earth than anyone else. But because there's limitations to her power and what she could do and couldn't do, there's some limitations. She can't be up here where this guy could take pretty much everything he wanted. She could not. There were still lords and other politicians in England that she had to respect, even if she didn't like them. So next up, Elon Musk. Elon Musk, I believe he's gonna go at the top of rich. He is the owner, well, not the owner, but the CEO of Tesla Motors. He's a big owner of it, but he's not the main owner. or no one is particularly. It's split up again amongst hundreds of buyers. But that being said, most of his wealth actually comes from SpaceX, a good chunk from Tesla, and then XAI, the AI company that Elon owns. So all of these things give him a net worth around $400 billion. And that being said, he is on track to actually being the first recorded trillionaire in American history. But yeah, he's definitely at the top of rich. He's not quite up here with Rockefeller, but he is above these other guys, and everyone kind of knows him. He has his own worldviews on everything, and he loves to share them on Twitter after he bought Twitter for like 40, $20 billion, I forget. And then this guy is Allah Gamir. He was the Sultan of the Mughal Empire, or the Emperor of the Mughals. And let me tell you, this guy might actually be a contender for the richest man ever. I'm gonna actually put him above, maybe actually behind. He was the emperor of the Mughals when the Mughals pretty much owned all of India. They controlled all of India. They controlled good chunks of some of their neighboring territories too. But when he was ruling over India, India was also very important in his time because there was also a lot of trade with India. So the land and resources that he oversaw were actually very productive. He oversaw India when there was a huge trade for spice and these type of materials and goods that were coming out of India. Things like spices, other goods like some of the natural resources that you can find in India, and then shipping. That was also a big one as India had a lot of port cities, and a lot of these port cities were extremely important. And he ruled over all of that, so he controlled a good chunk of the world GDP. So I would say he was actually richer than Augustus purely because I think at the time when he was ruling over India, India was more important financially, and he also had less limitations on his power as Augustus did. Again, Augustus would have been the first emperor. You would have made sure you wouldn't have wanted to seem like he was too much of a king, so he had to make sure that he pretended there were some limitations, and there were some actual limitations on his power. Whereas for Al-Agmir, there weren't as many. It was already established that he was emperor of the Mughals. And that being said, this concludes the list. Tell me what you guys think. Looking over this list, I think this makes the most sense. Khosrow's ranking, it may change purely because if we look at his peak, not his downfall, he still owned a lot. But if you kind of also look at what he owned, a lot of what he did own was military occupation for an extremely short time without the population liking him and without having access to those resources. And then the nobility in Persia would have also limited him. And there was also the plague that happens that strips away a lot of the resources and kills off a lot of people. So the economic power in Persia falls apart. So that will cost his net worth to also go down. And then King Solomon, again, a biblical figure. Hard to say. What he owned was relatively small. That being said, he could have owned a lot in that relatively small piece of land. It's just hard to believe it, you know. Other guys like Mayer. Mayer may actually be the poorest person here, but that being said, also his legacy. Although legacy is not counted for some of these other guys, we're looking directly at their lifetimes. But just because of Mayer's legacy being so highly successful, we have to keep him up there. And then Paul Getty, Carnegie, Elon. I think this list makes sense in terms of their ranking. Getty was like the third. Carnegie is the second. Elon, modern day first. He's almost on par with Rockefeller. In the future, he'll probably be above Rockefeller. And then yeah, we have Crassus. Crassus owned a lot of real estate, owned a lot of properties, could buy men, and then owned slaves as well. I know it's a bit of a dark subject matter, but we do have to factor in absolutely everything. Oh yeah, and that's also something else to keep in mind for the Mongols. The Mongols also practiced slavery. So not only did they own all of the land that they controlled, all of the resources, he also owned all of the people. So yeah, that's what would make him the richest man ever. And you might say that's a little morbid if you count owning people as being wealthy. And to that, I would say that is what wealth is. in a lot of ways. It's the power to own people, partly, which is why, being ultra wealthy and being extremely greedy involves exploitation. So, I don't think the dark aspect of it or the morality aspect of it actually changes Monkey's ranking. He was still the richest man, whether or not what he was doing was immoral. And, that being said, it was immoral. I mean, what am I talking about? It's the Mongol Empire. These guys quite literally exterminated so many millions of people. But he was still the richest man in all of human history. So I think that concludes the list. Maybe there's some people here that would switch out. Maybe you can make some arguments that some of these people's power wasn't as limited or was more limited. But yeah, like Alexander the Great, he may not actually be as rich as these people, but actually, I think Alexander the Great, I'm gonna actually move him down a few pegs, I think. I think he was richer than Augustus purely because of the absolute monarchy aspect of it, but these guys were also absolute monarchs, and they would have had much more land, and it would have been at a time where that land was much more economically important. Like China, to trade with China was huge. China had all of the ports. It had the Silk Road, for crying out loud. I guess Iran also had the Silk Road, but the Silk Road in Alexander's time was not as well established. It was there, but it was nowhere near as well established. And then Alagmir, yeah, again, one of the most important countries on earth at the time when the country was the most important, and he was an absolute monarch, and he ruled over more of it than anyone else. So yeah, I think that concludes the list. If anyone has any questions, please leave it in the comments and let me know what other videos I should make. Thank you and have a great day.